There's a cat you've almost certainly seen. Round face, huge eyes, and ears that don't stand up like a normal cat's. They fold down flat against the skull, giving it that soft, owlish look that gets millions of likes online. The Scottish Fold. Genuinely one of the most photographed animals on the planet. And the part nobody puts on the caption is this. That folded ear isn't a cute quirk sitting on top of a healthy cat. It's a symptom. The exact same gene that softens the cartilage in those ears is quietly deforming the cartilage in the paws, the ankles, the tail, in every joint that cat owns. Research has revealed that all Scottish Fold cats are affected by a developmental abnormality that affects cartilage and bone formation throughout the body. Every single one. Not the unlucky ones. All of them. Let that sink in. The feature people find cutest, the reason they choose this cat over any other, is the injury. The fold and the pain are the same thing wearing two faces. You cannot have one without the other, because they come from one broken instruction written into the animal before it's even born. And this is where the whole story gets uncomfortable. Because the Scottish Fold isn't a mistake. Nobody bred a defect by accident. People saw the folded ear, decided it was adorable, and deliberately kept breeding for it, knowing, eventually, exactly what came attached. If that idea bothers you even a little, stick with me, because it's going to bother you a lot more in a few minutes. If you love this kind of deep dive into how the natural world actually works, the strange, the uncomfortable, the genuinely mind-bending, do me a quick favor and subscribe. It's the single thing that keeps these stories getting made. Now let's go back further than any cat show, further than any breeder, to a moment when cats and humans first struck a deal. Here's a fact that reframes everything that follows. Cats, unlike almost every other animal in your life, were never really tamed by us. We didn't go out and capture them. We didn't select them. They came to us. Cats largely domesticated themselves through a process known as commensalism, where animals adapt to living alongside humans without direct human control. Picture the Fertile Crescent, roughly 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, the strip of land that arcs across the modern Middle East, the cradle of farming. Humans have just done something world-changing. They've stopped wandering and started storing food. Around 10,000 years ago in the region, humans began storing grain, which led to an accumulation and rise in the population of the house mouse. And where there are mice, there is a golden opportunity for a small, patient, solitary predator. The wildcat of the region, Felis libica, wandered in from the desert edges, drew close to these grain heaps, and found an all-you-can-eat buffet that never ran out. Nobody invited them in with a plan. Attracted by rodents that were attracted to human agriculture, wildcats deliberately sought out agricultural communities. After thousands of years living alongside humans and preying upon rodents, they changed. Eventually, enough genetic variation arose between wildcats living in human communities and those out in the wild that a new species emerged, the domestic cat. The farmers didn't domesticate the cat. They just left the door open and the cat walked through on its own terms, which, if you know cats at all, is the most cat thing imaginable. We even have a witness to how old this bond is. The earliest record of domestication comes from a cat found deliberately buried with its owner in a grave in Cyprus, around 9,500 years ago. It's assumed domestication would have begun sometime before this, as there were no native cats in Cyprus. Someone carried a cat across water to an island. Someone laid one to rest beside a human they cared about. That's not pest control. That's the beginning of a friendship, written into a grave older than the pyramids. And now, here's the strange, quiet truth at the heart of this whole story. For most of those 9,000 years, the cat barely changed. Think about the dog. In the same stretch of time, humans stretched, shrank, squashed, and reshaped the wolf into everything from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane. Hundreds of wildly different animals, all bred hard for jobs. Herding, guarding, hunting, pulling. The cat kept one job, kill the mice, and it was already perfect at it. There was nothing to improve, so we left it alone. A cat that curled up by an Egyptian granary would look almost identical to the cat curled up on your windowsill right now. 9,000 years, and evolution essentially hit pause. Which raises the question that this entire story turns on. If cats stayed nearly unchanged for 90 centuries, what happened in the last 150 years? Because almost every dramatic thing about cat breeds, every flat face and folded ear and twisted joint, is astonishingly recent. Blink of an eye recent. And it all traces back to a single afternoon in Victorian London. The date is the 13th of July, 1871.
The place is the Crystal Palace, a vast cathedral of glass and iron in South London, the kind of building that made Victorians feel like they'd conquered nature itself. Inside, something has happened that has genuinely never happened before. The first organized modern cat show is taking place, where roughly 160 cats are displayed and judged. The man behind it is an artist and illustrator named Harrison Weir. History would later call him the father of the cat fancy. And his idea was, on the surface, a lovely one. Weir conceived the notion that it would be well to hold cat shows so that the different breeds, colors, and markings might be more carefully attended to, and the domestic cat sitting in front of the fire would then possess a beauty and attractiveness to its owner previously unobserved and uncultivated. He wanted people to look at their cats, really look at them, and love them more. A kind man with a genuinely warm motive. But watch what he actually did, because it's the hinge the whole story swings on. In a few days, they developed the plan, establishing prizes, price of entries, classes, and points by which the cats would be judged. Points by which the cats would be judged. Weir sat down and wrote a document he called the Standards of Points, the very first written description of what an ideal cat of each type was supposed to look like. He was the first to set standards for specific cat breeds. And in that moment, on paper, something quietly flipped. Up until then, a cat was judged by what it could do: catch mice, survive, thrive. From that day forward, a growing number of cats would be judged by how closely they matched a picture, a drawing, an ideal on a page. That's the sentence I want you to hold on to, because everything painful that comes later grows out of it. The living animal became a design object. It stopped being measured against the world and started being measured against paper. The show itself was pure Victorian spectacle. The cats on display weren't ordinary tabbies. This was aristocracy on parade. In cage 50 was a black Persian, a huge black animal, originally belonging to the late Lord Palmerston. Prime ministerial cats. And the crowds absolutely ate it up. The show attracted over 20,000 visitors and featured more than 160 cats representing many different breeds. 20,000 people filing through a glass palace to admire cats behind bars. The cat fancy was born, and it was an instant phenomenon. Weir, to his credit, seems to have sensed something was off almost immediately. Within a few years, he'd fallen out badly with the club he helped inspire.
In his own bitter words, he found that many members cared less about the welfare of the cat than about winning prizes and their own club medals. He therefore felt it his duty to leave the club, and he also left off judging cats, even at his own much-loved show at the Crystal Palace, because he no longer cared to come into contact with such lovers of cats. Read that again. The man who invented the whole thing walked away in disgust because he watched the trophy start to matter more than the animal.
The father of the fancy quit the fancy, and the machine he built rolled on without him. A machine that, over the next century, would take that innocent idea of a beautiful cat by the fire and push it to places Weir could never have imagined. Into skulls that couldn't breathe and joints that couldn't bend. But to understand how a cat show turns into a cat's suffering, you need to understand what actually happens under the hood when a human being decides to select for a trait. Because it's not what most people picture. Most people imagine breeding is like picking the ripest apples. You choose the good ones, you get more good ones. Simple. It isn't simple at all. It's closer to something far messier and far more dangerous. Consider what a gene actually does. It rarely does just one job. When you reach into a cat's genome and select for a single visible trait, a folded ear, a flat face, a curled tail, you are almost never grabbing that trait alone. You're grabbing it by a handle that's attached to a whole tangle of other instructions you can't see. Geneticists call this pleiotropy. One gene, many effects. You wanted the folded ear, you got the folded ear. But the same gene was also whispering instructions to the cartilage in the ankles, and you dragged all of that along whether you wanted it or not. Think of it like buying a house because you fell in love with the front door. You don't get to keep just the door. The plumbing, the wiring, the cracks in the foundation, it all comes attached. And in the Scottish Fold's case, the foundation was cracked from the very start. Now stack a second problem on top. To lock in a breed, you have to close the gene pool. You take a small group of founding animals and you breed them to each other, and their descendants to each other, generation after generation, to keep the look consistent. Which sounds tidy until you realize what it does to the math. Every rare bad gene that happened to be sitting in those few founders gets concentrated, copied, and doubled up over and over. Scientists call it the founder effect. It's like photocopying a photocopy of a photocopy. The first copy looks fine. By the 50th, every little smudge and streak from the original has been amplified into something you can't ignore. Close a gene pool tightly enough, and you're not preserving a breed. You're Xeroxing its flaws until they're impossible to escape. And nowhere does this play out more cruelly, or more clearly, than in a single white barn cat, born on a farm in Scotland, who never asked to become the origin story of anything. Her name was Susie. The original Scottish Fold was a white barn cat named Susie, found at a farm near Cooper Angus in Tayside, Scotland, in 1961. Susie's ears had an unusual fold in their middle, making her resemble an owl. She was, by every account, an ordinary working cat, a mouser doing the same 9,000-year-old job her ancestors did in the Fertile Crescent. Except her ears bent forward and down in a way no one had quite seen before. A spontaneous mutation, a one-in-a-generation genetic accident. A neighboring farmer noticed. When Susie had kittens, 2 of them were born with folded ears, and one was acquired by William Ross and his wife, Molly, neighboring farmers who were cat fanciers. That kitten, a white female they called Snooks, became the ancestor of the entire breed. And it very nearly didn't happen at all, because Susie's window on the world slammed shut fast.
Susie's only reproducing offspring was a female foal named Snooks. A second kitten was neutered shortly after birth. Susie herself died not long after Snooks was born. So pause on the scale of this for a second. Every Scottish fold alive today, every single one in every viral video, every pet store window, every cattery on Earth, descends from one barn cat's brief life and one surviving daughter. That is the founder effect in its rawest form. An entire breed funneled through a genetic bottleneck the width of a single animal. The Rosses started breeding, and they brought in a geneticist to help make sense of the inheritance. The breeding program produced 76 kittens in the first 3 years, 42 with folded ears, and 34 with straight ears. The conclusion was that the ear mutation is due to a simple, dominant gene. A single dominant gene. One copy is enough to fold the ear. Clean, predictable, easy to breed for. On paper, a breeder's dream. But the same simplicity that made it easy to reproduce is exactly what makes it impossible to escape. Because that one gene was never only about ears. And the story of what it's really doing, inside the ankles, inside the tail, inside joints that were meant to move freely and instead slowly fuse into stiff, painful stone, is where the cuteness ends and the cost begins. Go back to that barn near Cooper Angus in 1961. Susie is doing what she was born to do, walking the beams, hunting the grain store, an ordinary Scottish farm cat with an extraordinary fold in her ears. And to the Rosses, to the neighbors, to everyone who cooed over how much she looked like a little owl, the ears were the whole story. That was the miracle.
That was the charm. But if you'd watched her closely, really watched, you might have noticed something else. Something in the way she moved. Because osteochondrodysplasia, the disease baked into that fold, doesn't only touch the ears. It touches every joint the cat owns. And the earliest, most reliable warnings show up not in the head, but in the feet and the tail. The tail feels short, thick, and inflexible when handled. The limbs and feet appear malformed. In the worst cases, the paws look almost swollen, the toes splayed and stiff, the tail rigid as a stick where it should whip and coil like a length of rope. Nobody in that barn was looking for that. Why would they be? You don't examine a mouser's ankles. The ears folded, the kittens sold, the breed began. And the thing that was quietly wrong with the rest of the skeleton rode along underneath, invisible, waiting. It would take a geneticist and an X-ray machine and decades of stiff, aching cats before anyone said out loud what that single dominant gene was actually doing. So let's do what the Rosses couldn't. Let's look inside. Imagine a vet clipping an X-ray of a young Scottish fold onto the light. To an untrained eye, it's just a cat skeleton, pale bones on a dark field. But to someone who knows what healthy cartilage is supposed to look like, this image is genuinely disturbing. Because cartilage is the body's shock absorber and its scaffolding. It's the smooth, springy tissue that caps the end of every bone, so joints glide instead of grind. In a growing animal, cartilage is also the template the whole skeleton is built from. Bone is laid down along it, like concrete poured into a mold. Get the cartilage wrong, and you get the bone wrong. Everywhere. That's exactly what this gene does. Osteochondrodysplasia is a developmental abnormality that affects cartilage and bone formation throughout the body. The instructions for shaping cartilage misfire, and the result, on the X-ray, is grotesque in a very specific way. Near the joints, especially in the ankles and the tail, the bone doesn't stay smooth.
New growths of malformed bone erupt where they shouldn't, lumpy, spiky outcrops crowding into the joint space. The gaps between the bones, the cushioned gaps that let a cat leap and land in silence, narrow and choke. The bones start to fuse. What should be a hinge becomes a weld. Now imagine what that feels like from the inside. Every step, cartilage on cartilage, becomes bone grinding against jagged bone. The condition causes severe and painful degenerative joint disease, and the part that should stop anyone scrolling is this: it doesn't wait for old age. In severely affected cats, this arthritis arrives while they're still kittens. A creature built to be the most elegant jumper in your house, a small predator that can drop from a shelf and land like a whisper, is instead stiffening, hobbling, sometimes refusing to jump at all because landing hurts. And it never gets better. Cartilage doesn't regrow. There is no cure. Treatment is only management of pain. Then comes the sentence that reframes the entire breed. For a long time, breeders told themselves a comforting story. Only some folds are affected, the badly deformed ones, and if you're careful, you can breed the disease away while keeping the ears. It isn't true. Research established that all Scottish fold cats have some degree of osteochondrodysplasia. Every folded ear is a guarantee of joint damage somewhere in that body. The only question is how much, and how young it shows. The fold in the ear is the disease waving at you from the one place it happens to be visible. The ear is soft for the exact same reason the ankle is failing, because the cartilage everywhere is being built from a broken blueprint. You genuinely cannot separate the trait from the injury. They are one gene wearing two disguises. And once vets understood that, once the X-rays and the genetics lined up into a single, ugly picture, some of them refused to stay quiet. The loudest, clearest voice came out of Britain, the same country where Susie was born. The British Veterinary Association took a formal position and did not hedge it. They oppose the breeding of Scottish fold cats because the gene that gives them their folded ears also causes painful and debilitating joint problems. Their own president put it in language you rarely hear from a professional body, describing the popularity of these cats, driven by adverts and social media, as worrying, and saying plainly that people were choosing pets based on looks rather than health. They urged the public not to buy them at all. Prospective owners were asked to consider the health and welfare of the animal before buying, and simply not to purchase a Scottish fold. Sit with how strange that is. A national body of veterinarians, people whose entire job is caring for animals people want, standing up and saying, "Please stop wanting this one. Please stop buying it." The breed is the problem, and the pressure spread. In its country of origin, this cat is caught in a genuine tug-of-war. One governing cat body refuses to recognize or register the breed at all, on welfare grounds, while others still do. An animal so beloved online that it has its own memes, and so troubled that its homeland's own registry won't put its name on paper. The breeders push back, and their argument is emotional and effective. The cats are affectionate, they're gentle, they're loved, owners adore them. All true. Nobody's disputing that a Scottish fold can be a sweet companion. But that's precisely the trap. The affection is real, and the pain is also real. And the folded ear that made you fall in love is the physical proof of the second thing. The tragedy isn't that these cats aren't lovable. It's that we fell in love with the symptom. Now, keep that thought close. The trait people find most charming being the injury itself. Because there's another cat, far older and far more famous than the fold. where the exact same trap was set.
Not in a single dramatic gene, but slowly, gently, one show at a time, over 300 years. And it happened to the animal's face, the Persian, that flat, flowered, aristocratic face, the squashed nose, the wide-set eyes, the flat, round head, didn't come from nature. Nature never built a cat like that, and for good reason. That face is the endpoint of centuries of humans deciding that flatter was prettier and rewarding it, ribbon by ribbon, generation by generation. The scientific term for the result is brachycephaly, from the Greek for short head, and it is exactly what it sounds like, a skull that has been compressed, front to back, into a fraction of the length evolution spent millions of years perfecting. Think about how reckless that is. The length of a cat's face isn't decoration, it's plumbing, it's engineering. Inside that elongated muzzle, a wild cat carries a beautifully tuned air conditioning and filtration system, long nasal passages lined with delicate scrolls of bone that warm the air, humidify it, filter it, and cool the blood flowing to the brain on a hot day. It's the difference between breathing through an open hallway and breathing through a folded, crumpled one. When you push the face flatter and flatter, you don't delete that hallway. You can't. The soft tissue, the nostrils, the palate, the throat is still all there. You've just crushed the room it was supposed to fit inside. So imagine trying to breathe through a drinking straw. Now imagine that straw has been stepped on, kinked, pinched, half flattened. That's the everyday reality inside the airway of an extreme brachycephalic cat. The nostrils are pinched to slits. The soft palate at the back of the throat, still built to its original length, now sags into an airway that's far too short to hold it, partly blocking the passage on every breath. This is brachycephalic airway syndrome, and its signs are heartbreakingly ordinary once you know to see them. The snoring, the snuffling, the open mouth panting after the mildest play, the cat that overheats on a warm afternoon because it can no longer cool itself the way a cat is supposed to. What owners have been trained to hear as cute, the little snores, the noisy breathing, is the sound of an animal working hard to do the one thing that should be effortless. The face pays a second toll, too, one you can see without a stethoscope. Push the skull that flat, and you also crush the drainage. A cat's tears are meant to run down a tiny duct from the inner corner of the eye into the nose. Compress the face, and that duct kinks shut, so the tears have nowhere to go. They spill over the cheeks instead, endless, wet, rust-colored streaks staining the fur beneath those big, beautiful, wide-set eyes. Eyes that, in the most extreme cats, bulge slightly because the sockets themselves are too shallow to hold them properly. A face bred to look serene and doll-like, weeping constantly because the plumbing behind it has nowhere left to send the water. Look at that cat honestly, and you see the same equation as the fold, just written more slowly. We found a face beautiful. We selected for it, hard, for centuries. And a skull, crushed short enough to look adorable, is a skull too short to breathe through. Once again, we fell in love with the injury and called it a breed. 2 cats. One, a sudden mutation in a Scottish barn. The other, 3 centuries of quiet pressure in the show ring. Same trap, sprung 2 completely different ways. And that pattern, falling in love with the very thing that hurts the animal, you might want to believe it's just a cat problem. Something peculiar to a niche hobby, a handful of breeds. It isn't. Because everything you've just heard, every crushed airway and fused joint and weeping eye, has an echo somewhere, far louder, far bigger,
in the oldest domesticated partner we have.
If this is what 150 years did to the cat, the animal we barely touched for 9,000 years, then what on earth did tens of thousands of years of breeding do to the dog? Stand ringside at a major dog show. Under the lights, a German shepherd is being walked in a slow circle, and the crowd leans in, because this is the breed that built the modern idea of a working dog, the police dog, the guide dog, the hero on the screen. But watch the profile as it moves. The back doesn't run straight and level from shoulder to tail the way a wolf's does. It slopes. It curves downward toward the hips in a dramatic arc, and the back legs bend so deeply that the dog almost seems to crouch as it walks, hocks nearly brushing the ground. To the judge, that sloping line and those angled rear legs are the picture of the breed. To a veterinarian looking at the same dog on an X-ray table, it's something else entirely. Because that beautiful slope has a cost written into the spine and the joints beneath it. A vet reading those radiographs sees hips that don't sit cleanly in their sockets, a pelvis tilted into an unnatural angle, and rear legs whose deep, dramatic bend loads the joints in a way nature never intended. The most extreme showline dogs can barely trot without their back ends swaying. It's the fold's story again, told in a bigger animal, a shape that wins ribbons and quietly wrecks the body carrying it. Now here's what makes this so hard to simply condemn, and I want to be fair, because the breeders are not cartoon villains. Talk to an honest show breeder about that sloped back, and they'll explain, genuinely believing it, that the angle was meant to give the dog a long, ground-covering stride, a smooth, reaching gait that looks like the dog is flowing rather than walking. They're chasing a picture of athletic beauty, the same instinct Harrison Weir had at the Crystal Palace, the same instinct that found an owl-eared barn cat charming. The intention is almost always love. That's the whole trap. Nobody in this story wakes up wanting to hurt an animal. They wake up wanting to make something beautiful. And it turns out, again and again, that the beauty and the harm are wearing the same face. And sometimes the harm isn't in the shape at all. Sometimes it's invisible, riding silently in the blood. And you don't find out until it's already everywhere. Come back to the Persian, but this time forget the flat face and look inside, at the kidneys. There's a disease called polycystic kidney disease, PKD, and in Persians, it became one of the most common inherited diseases in the entire cat world. Fluid-filled cysts grow in the kidneys, present from birth, tiny at first, and then, slowly, over years, they swell and multiply and crowd out the healthy tissue until the kidneys simply fail. It's caused by a single dominant gene, which means one affected parent can pass it to roughly half its kittens. Before a genetic test existed, studies put the proportion of affected Persians at somewhere around a third of the breed. A time bomb in the abdomen, carried by an enormous share of an entire beloved population. Picture the breeder who lived through that discovery. A man with a champion, a stud cat that's won everything, the pride of his line, the animal his whole cattery is built around. Then the genetic test arrives, the one that can finally read this gene directly, and he sends off a cheek swab almost as a formality. The result comes back positive. His champion, the beautiful, celebrated, endlessly bred cornerstone of his program, is a carrier. And in that moment, he has to reckon with arithmetic that's genuinely sickening. Every litter that cat has ever sired, every kitten sold as the promise of the line, carried a coin flip chance of the disease, not a distant risk. His own animals, in other people's homes, generations of them, already out there, already breeding.
You don't undo that. A single popular stud can seed a fault through a breed faster than anyone can trace it, and by the time the test exists, the damage is a family tree with poison in half the branches. That, at least, has a partial ending you can feel good about, because the test changed things. Responsible breeders started screening, refused to breed carriers, and the numbers came down. It's proof that when we can see the harm clearly, we can choose to stop passing it on. But it only works when someone agrees the harm matters more than the ribbon. And that agreement is exactly where the whole thing fractures. So put the two of them in a room, a veterinarian and a breeder, at a table, trying to write down what a healthy version of a breed should look like. This is not a philosophy seminar. This is a real conflict happening in real committees right now, and it's brutal. Because they don't actually disagree about the science. They disagree about a single word: acceptable. The vet points at a flat-faced cat and says the airway is compromised. Full stop. This animal struggles to breathe. And any standard that rewards a flatter face rewards suffering. The breeder doesn't deny the airway. The breeder says, "My cats live full lives. They're loved. And if you flatten the face just a little less, you don't have the breed anymore. You've erased 3 centuries of what makes it itself." The vet says, "A little suffering is still suffering." The breeder says, "A little change is still extinction." And the horrible thing is that from inside each of their worlds, both of them are right. They are using the same facts and reaching a wall. Because underneath the argument sits a question that no X-ray can answer. How much of an animal's comfort are we allowed to trade for its identity? And who gave us the right to make that trade at all? That's the real knot. Not whether these diseases are real. They are, beyond dispute. The knot is that we built these creatures. We invented the folded ear, the flat face, the sloping spine. We wrote them into being over decades and centuries. And now we're standing over our own creations, arguing about what we owe them. And there are, genuinely, 2 futures fanning out from that table. And we're about to choose which one to walk through. Behind the first door is the fix from the outside. The reformers who say, outcross. Open the closed gene pool back up. Breed the Persian to a cat with a functional face. Breed the folds problem out entirely by refusing the fold. Accept that the breed will change its look in order to keep its body. Some registries are already inching this way, rewriting standards to reward a longer muzzle, an open nostril, a level back, treating the paper ideal as something that can be edited rather than worshipped. It's slow, it's fought over every inch, and it asks people to let go of the exact features they fell in love with. But it works, because it treats the animal as more important than the picture. Behind the second door is the fix from the inside, and it's coming faster than most people realize. Gene editing. The tools now exist, in principle, to reach into the genome and switch off the broken instruction directly. To leave the fold, keep the flat face people adore, and simply delete the pain that comes attached. Snip out the osteochondrodysplasia, keep the owl ears. Erase the airway disease, keep the doll face. It sounds like mercy. It might be. But it carries a quiet, vertiginous implication. For the first time, we wouldn't just be selecting from what nature hands us, we'd be authoring these animals outright, editing living things to match a drawing, and then telling ourselves the drawing was worth keeping. We'd have finally, fully closed the loop that opened in a glass palace in 1871, when a living creature first became a design object. If any of this has changed the way you'll look at the next flat-faced cat or sloked-back dog you see, subscribe, because these are the stories I think are worth telling slowly, and you keep them alive just by being here. Here's where I have to be honest with you. I don't know which door is right. I'm not sure anyone does. And that uncertainty is the whole point. Because there is someone entirely absent from that table where the vet and the breeder argue. The cat, the dog, they don't get a vote. They never did. Susie didn't choose to become the mother of a breed.
That Persian champion didn't choose to carry a fault in his kidneys.
The German shepherd in the show ring didn't decide that a sloping spine was beautiful. Each of these animals is simply living out a choice a human being made about what an animal should look like. And then, decades later, other humans stand over them deciding whether that was cruelty or love, or both at once. 9,000 years ago, a wildcat walked out of the desert toward a pile of grain and struck a bargain with us. One where it stayed a cat, whole and capable and free to walk away. Somewhere in the last 150 years, without ever asking the other side, we quietly changed the terms of that deal. And the creatures we changed can't tell us whether they'd have agreed. They can only live inside the answer we chose for them, and trust, as they've trusted us for 90 centuries, that the hand reaching down means them well. The only real question left is whether we deserve that trust. And that one, we have to answer for them.